"I'll give $10M if you translate this," laughed the Mafia boss, but the shy waitress silenced him. "I'll give $10 million in cold cash to anyone who can translate this." Ezra laughed, his voice a dangerous rumble that froze the diner. He slammed a weathered, ink-stained parchment onto the Formica table, flanked by his hulking enforcers. "But you can't. The only man who spoke this dialect died before telling me where the truth is buried." The syndicate boss leaned back, swirling his espresso with arrogant amusement, daring the terrified patrons to even breathe. From the shadows of the counter, a trembling hand set down a coffee pot. Sadie, the painfully shy waitress, stepped forward. It says," she whispered, breaking the silence, "that the legacy is a lie." The midnight storm lashed against the grease-stained windows of the Starlight Diner, blurring the flickering neon sign into a smeared halo of electric blue and violent red. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale filter coffee, burnt hash browns, and the lingering dampness of rain-soaked wool. Sadie stood behind the scuffed linoleum counter, a damp rag clutched in her pale, trembling hands. She wiped the same spot over and over, the rhythmic, circular motion serving as the only anchor in a world that constantly threatened to overwhelm her. She was a ghost in her own life, a 23-year-old woman who had perfected the art of blending into the faded wallpaper. Her uniform was a size too big, swallowing her slight frame, and her dark hair was pulled back into a tight, severe bun that offered no place to hide. Yet, hiding was all she ever did. She knew the regulars not by their names, but by their orders and the specific depths of their loneliness. The midnight shift was a sanctuary for the broken, the lost, and the unseen. It was a place where nobody asked questions, and more importantly, nobody looked at her twice. Tonight, the thunder outside seemed to echo the perpetual, nervous drumming of her own heart. The diner was sparsely populated. A long-haul trucker snored softly in the corner booth, his face pressed against a crumpled napkin. 2 booths down, an elderly woman methodically stirred her tea, staring into the dark street as if waiting for a ghost to walk by. Sadie found a strange comfort in this shared isolation. She didn't have to perform. She didn't have to speak above a whisper. She could exist in the quiet margins, far away from the piercing gazes of a world she felt entirely ill-equipped to handle. Her mind drifted to her grandmother, the only person who had ever truly seen her. The old woman had passed away 2 years ago, leaving behind an aching void and a mind full of memories, including the strange, melodic words of a forgotten language they used to whisper in the dark. It was a secret bond, a fortress built of syllables and ancient syntax that no one else could penetrate. Now, with her grandmother gone, those words were locked away, buried beneath the mundane reality of serving black coffee to strangers in the dead of night. The sudden, jarring chime of the front doorbell shattered the fragile peace. The wind howled as the heavy glass door was shoved open, carrying with it a chilling wave of ozone and cold rain. Sadie froze, the damp rag slipping from her fingers. The atmosphere in the diner shifted instantly, plunging by 10 degrees. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken, paralyzing tension. The elderly woman stopped stirring her tea. The trucker jerked awake, his eyes wide and fearful. 4 men stepped into the diner, and they did not belong. They were dressed in impeccably tailored, dark overcoats that seemed to absorb the dim light, water beating off the expensive fabric. They moved with the terrifying, synchronized grace of apex predators entering an enclosure, but it was the man in the center who commanded the room, sucking the oxygen from the air simply by existing within it. His name was Ezra. He did not wear his power like a cheap suit. He carried it in his marrow. He was tall, his broad shoulders squared against the world, his face a landscape of hard angles and cold, calculating intelligence. His dark hair was slicked back, damp from the rain, framing eyes that were the color of shattered flint. There was a devastating stillness to him, a coiled violence that whispered of ruined lives and unbroken commands. He didn't carry a weapon visibly, but his very presence was an assault. The 3 behemoths surrounding him scanned the room, their hands resting subtly inside their coats. They were the muscle, the blunt instruments, but Ezra was the architect of the nightmare. Sadie felt her breath catch in her throat. Her instinct was to drop behind the counter, to make herself as small as humanly possible, to become dust. But her legs were rooted to the floor, her wide eyes locked on the terrifying procession moving toward the center of the diner. Ezra didn't look at the patrons. He didn't look at the cracked leather of the booths or the flickering fluorescent light overhead. He simply walked to the largest booth in the back, the one shrouded in shadows, and sat down. His men took their positions, 2 sliding into the booth opposite him. one standing guard near the aisle, his bulk blocking the path to the restrooms. The silence in the diner was absolute, broken only by the relentless drum-chanliff of the rain against the glass. The trucker slowly, carefully, slid out of his booth, leaving a crumpled $20 bill on the table before practically sprinting out the door into the storm. The elderly woman shrank into her seat, her eyes fixed firmly on her lukewarm tea. Sadie stood paralyzed behind the counter, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. From the kitchen, the bell dinged, a sharp, inappropriate sound in the heavy silence. "Order up, Sadie," the cook rasped from the service window. Oblivious to the terror that had just walked through the front door, Sadie squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the rising tide of panic. She had to go over there. She had to take their order. She took a shuddering breath, her hands gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. She reached for the glass coffee pot, the handle feeling like ice against her skin. Every step out from behind the safety of the counter felt like walking a plank over a dark, bottomless ocean. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, focusing on the scuff marks on the linoleum, terrified that if she made eye contact with the man in the dark coat, she would simply cease to exist. She approached the booth, her shadow stretching long and thin across the floor, stepping into the orbit of a man who owned the night and everything breathing within it. The air around the back booth was suffocating, thick with the scent of expensive bergamot cologne, damp wool, and an unmistakable, metallic tang of adrenaline. Sadie's hands shook so violently that the dark liquid inside the glass coffee pot sloshed against the rim, threatening to spill over. She kept her gaze pinned to the cracked red leather of the table, terrified of meeting the flint-gray eyes of the man sitting there. "Coffee?" she stammered, her voice so thin and fragile it barely carried over the sound of the rain lashing the window behind them. Ezra did not look up. He was staring at the table, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscle ticked visibly beneath his skin. One of his massive enforcers, a man with a jagged scar cutting through his eyebrow, gave a curt, dismissive nod. Sadie poured the coffee, focusing all her energy on keeping the stream steady, terrified that a single spilled drop would be her death sentence. She filled their mugs and took a frantic step backward, desperate to retreat to the safety of her counter. "He died screaming," the scarred enforcer said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that made Sadie's blood run cold. She froze mid-step, her back to them, unable to move forward, unable to tear herself away. Said he was the last one. The old man made sure of it before he put a bullet in his own head. Ezra let out a breath that sounded like a curse. He was a fool. Ezra's voice was smooth, cultured, yet layered with an intoxicating danger. It was the sound of a velvet noose tightening. "My father was a paranoid, sentimental fool. He hides the ledger, the only thing that proves the syndicate's true lineage, the only thing that names the rats in my own house, and he writes it in a dead tongue. A ghost language." Sadie turned slightly, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath catching in her throat. She watched as Ezra reached into the inner pocket of his dark, water-resistant overcoat. He pulled out a folded piece of parchment. It wasn't standard paper. It was thick, yellowed with age, its edges frayed and uneven. He slammed it onto the formica table, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet diner. Sadie's eyes were drawn to it like a magnet. Even from 3 feet away, she could see the heavy, dark ink scarring the surface. It wasn't written in English. It wasn't written in anything resembling a standard alphabet. It was a chaotic, flowing script of sharp angles and sweeping curves, interspersed with strange, geometric symbols. "3 linguists," the other enforcer muttered, taking a sip of the scalding coffee without flinching. 2 cryptographers from the Fed's payroll. None of them could make heads or tails of it. They said it looks like a bastardized mix of archaic Sicilian and a localized cipher that hasn't been spoken in a century. "It's from the deep mountains," Ezra said, his voice dropping into a dark, frustrated timbre. He reached out, his long, elegant fingers tracing the edge of the paper. "The village my father was born in, a village that was burned to the ground 60 years ago. The dialect died with the ashes. He used it as a lock, knowing only a handful of people in the world could ever read it. And now, the last man who could is lying in a morgue on the east side, his throat cut by whoever is trying to keep me from reading this." Sadie stood frozen, the coffee pot hanging heavy from her arm. Her eyes were locked on the document. The flickering overhead light caught the ink, and suddenly, the chaotic lines began to shift. The sharp angles, the sweeping curves, the strange dots above the consonants. A violent shiver ripped through her body, starting at the base of her spine and exploding into her chest. She stopped breathing. The diner faded away. The smell of grease vanished. The sound of the rain was replaced by the warm, crackling sound of a fireplace and the soft, melodic voice of her grandmother. "Listen, little bird." Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "The world will try to make you forget where you came from. They will speak loudly, but our words carry the weight of the mountains. Memorize the shapes. They are not just letters, they are the bones of our ancestors." It was the script. The exact, unmistakable script her grandmother had painstakingly drawn out on scraps of paper at the kitchen table. The secret language they used when her grandmother didn't want Sadie's abusive stepfather to understand them. It was a dialect so remote, so specific to a tiny, forgotten valley in Sicily, that it had never been formally recorded. It was a language of survival, of hidden meanings, of blood and soil, and it was sitting right there, on a greasy diner table, illuminated by a flickering neon light, guarded by men who killed for a living. Sadie's eyes scanned the first visible line. Her brain, trained for years in secret, automatically decoded the strange symbols, translating the ancient phonetic structures into English. The words formed in her mind, heavy and terrifying. It wasn't a ledger. It wasn't a map to money. It was a confession. It was a desperate, bleeding plea from a father to a son. "We burn it," the scarred enforcer suggested coldly. "If we can't read it, the traitors can't either. We purge the ranks the old-fashioned way, bullet to the back of the head for anyone who looks sideways." "No," Ezra said, his voice snapping like a whip. "The ledger is in here. The accounts. The names of the men who betrayed my family 10 years ago. Without this, I am swinging in the dark. I need to know who ordered the hit on my mother. I will not burn the only bridge to the truth." He leaned back against the red leather, a look of profound, dangerous exhaustion crossing his face. He looked at the paper with a mixture of hatred and desperate reverence. Sadie knew she should walk away. Every survival instinct she had honed over 23 years screamed at her to turn around, walk back to the counter, and disappear into the background. These men were monsters. They lived in a world of blood and shadows, a world that crushed girls like her without a second thought. If she spoke, she would make herself visible. She would step into the crosshairs of a Mafia war. But as she looked at the first line of the translation in her head, she realized the magnitude of the secret she was holding. The document wasn't just a list of names. It was a ghost crying out for peace. And for the first time in her life, Sadie felt an overwhelming, terrifying urge to speak for the dead. Ezra let out a bitter, hollow laugh that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. He dragged a hand down his face, the picture of a king staring at a crumbling empire. "It's a joke," he said, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. He gestured broadly to the empty diner, the greasy walls, the rain-streaked windows. "My father leaves the key to the entire kingdom, the names of the rats trying to slaughter me, and he writes it in a dead man's scribble. I'd give $10 million in cold, hard cash to anyone in this pathetic city who can translate this," he announced to the empty room. A dark, theatrical mockery born of absolute frustration. "But you can't, because the only man who knew this dialect died before he could tell me where my family's legacy is buried." He leaned back, swirling the black coffee in his mug, a bitter, arrogant smile playing on his lips. He was daring the universe to challenge him, knowing full well he was untouchable. The enforcers chuckled, a low, menacing sound that rattled the silverware. Behind them, the soft clatter of glass against formica broke the heavy atmosphere. Sadie had set the coffee pot down on an empty table. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to interlock her fingers and press them hard against her stomach to keep them still. Her breathing was shallow, erratic, her chest tight with an agonizing panic. The diner walls seemed to be closing in, the flickering neon light pulsing in time with the frantic beating of her heart. "Don't do it," her mind screamed. "Walk away. Be invisible. Be nothing. You are nothing." But the words on the parchment burned in her mind's eye. The elegant, sharp symbols of her grandmother's secret world. It felt like a betrayal of her own blood to let those words go unread. To let a father's dying confession be treated as a useless scrap of paper by violent men. Before her conscious mind could stop her, her feet moved. One step, then another. She walked away from the safety of the counter, stepping out of the shadows and into the harsh, unforgiving light of the back booth. Her worn sneakers made soft, hesitant sounds against the linoleum, each step feeling like she was walking on the edge of a razor blade. The enforcer standing guard by the aisle saw her first. He shifted his massive weight, stepping slightly to block her path, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Back behind the counter, sweetheart," he grunted, dismissing her entirely. "We didn't ask for a refill." Sadie stopped. The man was a wall of muscle and menace, his jacket falling open just enough to reveal the dark, metallic glint of a shoulder holster. The smell of violence radiating from him was nauseating. Her voice died in her throat. She looked down at her battered shoes, her resolve crumbling. She was a waitress, a nobody. She was about to turn around and run back to her hiding place. But then, Ezra spoke. "Let her through, Marcus." The enforcer hesitated, then stepped aside. Sadie looked up. Ezra was watching her. The sheer intensity of his gaze was a physical weight, pinning her to the spot. His eyes, cold and calculating, dissected her in a fraction of a second. Seeing the oversized uniform, the trembling hands, the pale, terrified face, he saw someone utterly inconsequential. "Did you need something?" Ezra asked, his tone laced with a dangerous, condescending patience. Sadie forced herself to take the final step toward the table. She didn't look at the enforcers. She didn't even look at Ezra's face. She looked down at the weathered parchment lying between the coffee mugs. She raised her trembling hand and pointed a pale finger at the top line of the jagged, chaotic script. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The air in the diner felt thin, insufficient. She closed her eyes, summoning the image of her grandmother, the smell of the old kitchen, the warmth of the fireplace. She found the cadence of the mountains. When she opened her eyes, she didn't look at the paper. She looked directly into Ezra's terrifying, flint-gray eyes. It says, she began, her voice a fragile, wavering whisper that nonetheless carried through the absolute silence of the room. She swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "It says that the legacy is a lie." The atmosphere in the diner shattered. The enforcer with the scar slammed his hand onto the table, half rising from his seat, his face twisting into a mask of fury. "What kind of game are you playing, girl? Get the hell out of here before I—" "Sit down." Ezra's voice was a low, seismic rumble that instantly froze the massive man mid-movement. Ezra didn't look at his enforcer. He didn't break eye contact with Sadie. The arrogant amusement had entirely vanished from his face, replaced by a look of absolute, paralytic shock. The color drained from his skin, leaving him looking like a carved marble statue. He stared at the shy, trembling waitress in the oversized uniform, as if she had just materialized from thin air, a ghost speaking from the grave. "Read it again," Ezra commanded, his voice tight, stripped of all its previous smoothness. It was the voice of a man hanging onto the edge of a cliff. Sadie's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at the paper again, her eyes tracing the second line. The symbols, so foreign and chaotic to the men at the table, sang to her in her grandmother's voice. She took a deep, shaky breath, her voice growing a fraction steadier as the familiarity of the language washed over her. "It says," Sadie translated, her finger moving slowly beneath the text, "To my son Ezra, if you are reading this, the legacy you seek is a lie. I have built an empire on sand and blood, and the crown I leave you is poisoned. The men standing beside you are the wolves who will tear you apart." A suffocating, deathly silence descended upon the table. The rain outside seemed to roar, a deafening backdrop to the explosive tension crackling in the air. Ezra sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on the paper, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rigid breaths. The two enforcers in the booth exchanged a rapid, terrified glance, the atmosphere instantly turning from arrogant confidence to lethal paranoia. The waitress hadn't just spoken a dead language. She had just lit a fuse in a room full of dynamite. The diner felt as though it had been submerged underwater. The pressure in the air was absolute, pressing against Sadie's eardrums, making it difficult to draw a full breath. She stood at the edge of the booth, her finger still hovering over the ancient parchment, suddenly hyper-aware of her immense vulnerability. She had exposed a nerve in the most dangerous man in the city. Ezra was staring at the paper, his jaw locked, his eyes tracking the chaotic symbols as if willing them to change back into gibberish. The silence stretched, tight and agonizing, until the scarred enforcer, whose name she had gathered, was Marcus, broke it. "She's lying," Marcus spat, his voice a harsh, panicked rasp. He glared at Sadie, his hand inching instinctively toward his chest. "She's some local trash trying to hustle you for the money, boss. She probably read a book or something. This is a setup." "Shut up, Marcus," Ezra whispered. He didn't yell. The quietness of his command was far more terrifying than a shout. It held the promise of immediate, violent death. He finally dragged his eyes away from the letter and looked up at Sadie. The cold, calculating predator was gone, replaced by a man staring into an abyss. "How do you know this language?" Sadie swallowed the lump of terror in her throat. She clutched her hands together, her nails digging into her palms to ground herself. My grandmother, she said, her voice trembling but gaining a strange, desperate strength. She was born in a village called Rocca di Mezzo, deep in the Madoni Mountains. She said the language wasn't written down in books. It was taught by mothers to daughters, to keep secrets from the men who ruled the valleys. Ezra let out a breath that sounded like a fractured pane of glass. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Rocca di Mezzo, he repeated, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. It was burned in 64. Wiped off the map. She survived, Sadie said softly. She brought the words with her. Ezra stared at her, truly looking at her for the first time. He saw past the oversized uniform and the severe bun. He saw the genuine terror in her eyes. But beneath that, a profound, unshakable sincerity. He looked back at the letter. Sit down, he ordered, gesturing to the empty space on the curved leather bench next to the window. Sadie hesitated, her panic flaring. Sitting down meant joining them. It meant becoming part of whatever violent nightmare this was. But the look in Ezra's eyes left no room for refusal. It wasn't a request. It was gravity. Trembling, she slid into the booth, pressing her back flush against the cold glass of the rain-battered window. Trying to put as much distance between herself and the men as the small space allowed, the enforcer sitting opposite her shifted his massive weight, glaring at her with open hostility. Keep reading, Ezra commanded, pushing the parchment slightly toward her. Every word. Do not skip a single syllable. Do not try to soften it. Sadie looked down at the letter. The ink was faded, the handwriting erratic, speaking of a man writing in haste, perhaps in fear. She took a deep breath, letting the chaotic environment fade away, focusing solely on the shapes, the geometry of the ancient dialect. I have spent my life hunting shadows, Sadie translated, her voice soft but steady, the melodic cadence of her grandmother's language bleeding into her English translation. I believed the greatest threats came from the rival families, from the police, from the ghosts of the men I have buried. But the rot is not outside our walls, Ezra. The rot is at the foundation. The ledger you seek, the one detailing our offshore accounts and the blackmail files, it does not exist. I burned it. Marcus let out a sharp, involuntary hiss. He's lying. The old man was crazy at the end. He wouldn't burn the leverage. Ezra ignored him, his eyes boring into Sadie. Read, I burned it because the leverage was being used against us. Sadie continued, her eyes tracing the frantic loops of the ink. For 10 years, someone inside our inner circle has been bleeding us dry, selling our routes, giving up our shipments to the feds. They convinced me to hunt ghosts while they stole our empire from within. The ambush in Palermo, the one that took your mother. Sadie's voice broke. She stopped, staring at the words, her blood running cold. Ezra's entire body went rigid. The air around him seemed to crystallize. Read it, he said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, guttural whisper. Read what it says about my mother. Sadie looked up, terrified by the sheer, unadulterated pain and rage warring in his eyes. She looked back down, her voice trembling. The ambush in Palermo was not a rival hit. It was an inside job. They knew our route. They knew the armor on the car was compromised. I spent a decade torturing the wrong men, blinding myself to the truth because the traitor was sitting at my own dinner table. The diner was dead silent. The revelation hung over the booth like a guillotine blade. Ezra's father had just confessed, from beyond the grave, that his mother's murder, the inciting incident that had turned Ezra into a ruthless, heartless kingpin, was an act of treason from within his own family. Sadie could see the tectonic plates of Ezra's world shifting, crashing against each other. The hardened exterior of the Mafia boss was cracking, revealing the bleeding, furious sun beneath. He's giving me the name, Ezra realized, his voice hollow. He leaned forward, his massive frame casting a dark shadow over the table. He's giving me the name of the man who killed her. Sadie nodded slowly, her eyes scanning the bottom half of the parchment. The script here grew wilder, more desperate. Yes, she whispered. The next paragraph. He names him. Before she could speak the next word, a large, heavy hand slammed down on the center of the parchment, pinning it to the table. Sadie gasped, pulling her hands back as if burned. She looked up. It was Marcus. The scarred enforcer was leaning across the table, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill in the diner. His eyes were wide with a frantic, cornered desperation. That's enough, Marcus barked, his voice cracking. He looked at Ezra, a manic urgency in his expression. Boss, this is a trick. The girl is making it up. The old man was senile. He was paranoid. You can't listen to this garbage. We need to leave. Now Sadie shrank back against the window. the cold glass biting through her thin uniform. She looked at Marcus, then at the parchment beneath his hand, and suddenly, the pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. She didn't need to read the rest of the letter to know the name. The truth was written plainly in the violent panic radiating from the man sitting across from her. She had just stepped directly into the middle of a Mafia coup, and the traitor had just realized his execution order was being read aloud. The diner, previously a sanctuary of quiet isolation, had transformed into a powder keg. Marcus's heavy hand remained pressed flat against the ancient parchment, his knuckles white with strain. The scarred enforcer was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically between Ezra's impassive face and the terrified waitress pressed against the window. The third enforcer, the one standing guard by the aisle, shifted uneasily, his hand slipping inside his jacket, unsure of where the threat was coming from, waiting for a command that hadn't been given. Sadie felt a cold sweat break out across the back of her neck. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a continuous flutter in her chest. She was trapped in the booth, blocked by Ezra on one side, and the heavy wooden table in front of her. She watched Marcus's eyes, the desperate, cornered look of an animal about to strike. He wasn't just trying to stop the translation. He was trying to survive. "Move your hand, Marcus," Ezra said. His voice wasn't raised. It was unnervingly calm, smooth as dark glass. But it carried the weight of a falling anvil. He didn't move a muscle, but his entire demeanor had shifted from shocked son to the ruthless apex predator of the criminal underworld. "Ezra, listen to me," Marcus pleaded. The use of his boss's first name, a jarring breach of protocol that screamed of his panic. The old man lost his mind at the end. "You know this. He accused everyone. He accused your own brother before he died. This letter is poison. It's designed to tear us apart from the inside. We burn it, and we walk away," I said, Ezra repeated, his eyes locking onto Marcus with a terrifying, deadened focus. "Move your hand." Marcus didn't move. The silence stretched, tight and unbearable. The rain lashed against the window beside Sadie, the only sound in the suffocating stillness. Sadie looked down at the edge of the parchment, peeking out from beneath Marcus's thick fingers. She could see the first symbol of the next sentence. It was the symbol for brother-in-arms, followed by the modifier for deceit. She knew exactly what the letter was about to say. "She's a plant," Marcus snarled suddenly, pointing a thick, accusing finger at Sadie. "Look at her. You think some diner rat just happens to know a language the feds couldn't crack? She's working for the Rossi family. They set this up. They slipped her the translation. If she reads that name, it's a setup to get you to kill your own men." Sadie flinched as if struck. I'm not," she stammered, her voice barely a squeak. "I don't know anyone named Rossi. I just know what the paper says." "Shut your mouth," Marcus roared, his free hand dropping toward his waistband. The movement was incredibly fast, a blur of motion in the dim light. Ezra didn't stand up. He didn't even yell. His left hand shot across the table with terrifying speed, his fingers wrapping around Marcus's thick wrist like a steel vice before the enforcer could draw his weapon. The impact shook the table, rattling the coffee cups. Ezra's grip was brutal, twisting Marcus's wrist at an unnatural angle. Marcus gasped, a sound of sudden, shocking pain, his body jerking forward. "You forget yourself, Marcus," Ezra whispered, leaning across the table, his face inches from his lieutenant's. The cold, murderous intent in Ezra's eyes was paralyzing. "You do not raise your voice in my presence. You do not threaten a civilian when I am speaking to her, and you never reach for a weapon at my table." The third enforcer, standing in the aisle, froze completely, his hand still inside his coat. Paralyzed by the sudden violence between his boss and his captain, he didn't know who to back. And in Ezra's world, hesitation was usually fatal. Ezra applied a fraction more pressure to Marcus's wrist. A sickening pop echoed in the quiet diner. Marcus let out a strangled groan, his face draining of color, his jaw clenched in agony. His right hand, the one pinning the parchment, went slack, sliding off the ancient paper. "Now," Ezra said, his voice returning to that terrifying, smooth calm as he held the broken wrist of his lieutenant. He didn't look at Marcus anymore. He slowly turned his head, his flint-gray eyes fixing on Sadie, who was pressed so hard against the window she felt the cold seeping into her bones. "Read the name, Sadie," Ezra commanded gently. It was the first time he had used her name, reading it off the cheap plastic tag pinned to her oversized uniform. The sound of it coming from his mouth was both terrifying and strangely grounding. "Read the name of the man who killed my mother." Sadie looked at the parchment. The ink seemed to pulse beneath the flickering diner lights. She looked at Marcus. his face pale and sweating, his eyes wide with impending doom. She looked at Ezra, a man holding a storm inside him, demanding the truth that would tear his world apart. She was no longer just translating a document. She was acting as the executioner's blade. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes tracing the ancient symbols her grandmother had taught her in the safety of a warm kitchen, now bringing death into a cold, neon-lit diner. He stood beside me at her funeral. Sadie read, her voice steadying, anchored by the gravity of the words. He swore vengeance with you, but it was his hand that took the silver. The traitor, the architect of our ruin. She paused, the final symbol burning into her mind. She looked up, her eyes locking onto the terrified, sweating face of the man sitting across from her. Is Marcus? The name hung in the air, suspended in the heavy, grease-scented atmosphere of the diner like a physical weight. Marcus. The syllables echoed off the cracked linoleum and the rain-streaked windows. For a fraction of a second, time seemed to stop entirely. Sadie held her breath, her hands flat against the cold glass behind her, realizing she had just pushed the first domino in a chain reaction of absolute violence. Marcus's face, already pale from the pain in his broken wrist, turned the color of old ashes. The frantic, cornered energy drained out of him, replaced by the hollow, terrifying stillness of a man who realizes he is already dead. He didn't look at Ezra. He stared at the scratched formica table, his chest heaving. The third enforcer, still standing in the aisle, slowly, carefully pulled his empty hand out of his jacket, stepping back, physically and symbolically distancing himself from the condemned man. Ezra did not react immediately. He didn't shout. He didn't draw a gun. He sat perfectly still, his hands still clamped around Marcus's broken wrist. The silence was deafening. Sadie watched, mesmerized by terror, as the information filtered through Ezra's mind. She could see the memories flashing behind his flint-gray eyes, the funeral, the decade of bloody vengeance, the countless times Marcus had stood at his shoulder, acting as his shield, his confidant, his brother. The betrayal was so vast, so deeply rooted, it seemed to crack the very foundation of the man sitting beside her. Slowly, Ezra released Marcus's wrist. He leaned back against the red leather booth, the movement eerily calm. He picked up his coffee cup, his hand perfectly steady, and took a slow sip. The deliberate, mundane action in the face of such massive revelation was more chilling than any scream could have been. 10 years, Ezra said softly, his voice barely rising above the sound of the rain. He was speaking to the table, not to Marcus. 10 years I tore this city apart looking for the ghosts who hit that car. I burned down warehouses. I put men in the ground who had children. I did it all while you poured my drinks and told me we were getting closer. Marcus swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet diner. He slowly raised his head, his eyes meeting Ezra's. The panic was gone, replaced by a desperate, fatalistic bravado. He was weak, Ezra, Marcus rasped, his voice rough. Your father was losing his grip. He was letting the Rossi family encroach on our docks. He was going to negotiate. You don't negotiate with animals. I did what had to be done to protect the business. You killed my mother to protect the business? Ezra's voice was still soft, but the temperature in the booth plummeted. It was the voice of the abyss. She was in the car. Marcus hissed, his fear finally breaking through, twisting into anger. She wasn't supposed to be in the car. It was a mistake. But the old man, he had to go. He was going to ruin us all. I did it for you, Ezra. I cleared the path for you to take the throne. Ezra closed his eyes, a muscle in his jaw feathered. When he opened his eyes again, the last trace of humanity had been utterly extinguished from them. He looked at Marcus, and Sadie saw that he was no longer looking at a man, but at a corpse. Finish the letter, Sadie, Ezra commanded, not breaking his dead stare from Marcus. Sadie jumped slightly at the sound of her name. She looked down at the parchment, her eyes blurring with unshed tears of pure stress. She forced herself to focus, tracing the final, jagged lines at the bottom of the page. The handwriting here was chaotic, barely legible, written by a man who knew his time was measured in seconds. He thinks I do not know, Sadie translated, her voice trembling, the ancient Sicilian words tasting bitter in her mouth. But a dying man sees everything clearly. He will try to kill you, Ezra. When he realizes you are close to the truth, he will strike. The ledger, the real ledger with the offshore accounts, is not written down. It is hidden in the place where you buried your first dog, beneath the old oak. Take it. Destroy him. Avenge her. Sadie stopped. That was the end. The final symbol trailed off into an ink blot, a period placed with finality. Marcus let out a short, hysterical bark of laughter. The oak tree? That's his master plan? A scavenger hunt in the dirt? He looked at Ezra, desperation bleeding back into his eyes. Ezra, listen to me. I have the men. I have the captains. Half the syndicate answers to me now. You kill me. You start a civil war. You cannot win. You need me. Ezra slowly turned his head to look at Sadie. Is that everything? He asked gently. Yes, Sadie whispered, clutching her hands in her lap. That's all of it. Ezra nodded once. He reached into his coat. The movement was slow, deliberate, lacking any of the sudden violence he had shown earlier. He pulled out a thick, elegant fountain pen and placed it gently on the table. Then, he looked at the enforcer standing in the aisle. Take him out back, Ezra said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. Marcus's eyes widened in sheer terror. He scrambled against the booth, trying to slide out, but Ezra's hand shot out, grabbing Marcus by the throat, pinning him to the red leather with terrifying, effortless strength. Marcus gagged, his hands clawing uselessly at Ezra's wrist. You don't have the numbers, Ezra, Marcus choked out, his face turning purple. They'll kill you. Ezra leaned in, his face inches from Marcus's sweating, terrified visage. I am the numbers, Ezra whispered. He released his grip, shoving Marcus backward. The third enforcer stepped forward, hauling Marcus out of the booth by his collar. Marcus didn't fight back. The fight had been completely drained out of him. He looked like a hollowed-out shell as the massive enforcer dragged him toward the back hallway that led to the alleyway door. The sound of their footsteps echoed heavily on the linoleum, followed by the heavy thud of the metal fire door opening and slamming shut, cutting off the howl of the storm outside. The diner was suddenly, overwhelmingly silent again. The trucker was long gone. The elderly woman had slipped out during the confrontation. It was just Sadie, pressed against the window, and Ezra, sitting across from her, staring at the ancient parchment that had just rewritten his entire existence. Sadie didn't move. She barely breathed. She felt like she was trapped in the eye of a hurricane, waiting for the winds to return and tear her apart. The silence in the Starlight Diner was profound, heavy with the phantom echoes of violence and the crushing weight of revelation. Outside, the storm raged on, rain beating against the glass in a relentless rhythm. But inside, time seemed entirely suspended. Sadie remained frozen against the window, her hands still clutching each other in her lap. She was hyperventilating, shallow, silent breaths that didn't provide enough oxygen. She stared at the back hallway door, half expecting it to burst open, bringing the nightmare back into the light, but it remained shut. Ezra sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the parchment. He looked fundamentally different than the man who had swaggered through the door 20 minutes ago. The terrifying, untouchable aura of the Mafia boss had cracked, leaving behind a man who looked utterly devastated, hollowed out by a betrayal that cut deeper than bone. He slowly reached out, his long, scarred fingers tracing the chaotic, ink-stained symbols Sadie had just translated. He didn't know the language, but he was tracing the last movements of his father's hand. He knew. Ezra whispered to the empty room, his voice raspy, stripped of its cultured velvet. He sat across from me for 10 years, drinking my wine, mourning her with me. And he knew. Sadie didn't know what to say. There was nothing in her 23 years of invisible existence that had prepared her to comfort a ruthless crime lord who had just discovered his best friend murdered his mother. She felt an overwhelming urge to slide out of the booth, run behind the counter, and hide in the supply closet until dawn. But she was trapped. To move was to draw his attention, and drawing his attention felt like walking into a loaded gun. Ezra slowly lifted his head and looked at her. The cold, calculating predator was gone. The eyes that met hers were bloodshot, swimming with a volatile mixture of profound grief and a terrifying, cold-blooded resolve. He looked at her not as a waitress, not as a pawn, but as the oracle who had just handed him the truth. You, Ezra said softly, have a very dangerous gift. Sadie swallowed hard, forcing her throat to work. I just read what was there, she stammered, her voice shaking. I didn't mean to. I didn't want any trouble. A dark, bitter smile touched the corners of Ezra's mouth, lacking any real humor. Trouble walked through that door the moment I did, Sadie. You just turned the lights on so I could see it. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat again. Sadie flinched, bracing herself, but he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a sleek black leather checkbook and the heavy fountain pen he had placed on the table earlier. He flipped the checkbook open, uncapped the pen, and began to write, The scratching of the nib against the paper was loud in the quiet diner. He wrote deliberately, his face an unreadable mask. When he finished, he tore the check out with a sharp rip and slid it across the Formica table, pushing the ancient parchment aside. It stopped right in front of Sadie. She looked down. The numbers written in bold black ink seemed entirely abstract, a string of zeros that didn't make sense to her panicked brain. A 1, followed by 7 zeros. $10 million, Ezra said, his voice returning to a smooth, businesslike calm. I am a man of my word. You translated the document. You gave me the truth. The money is yours. It's drawn from a clean corporate account. No one will ask questions. Sadie stared at the check. $10 million. It was an impossible sum. It was enough money to buy the diner, tear it down, and build a mansion on the ashes. It was enough money to disappear forever, to never wear an oversized, stained uniform again, to never worry about making rent or hiding from her abusive stepfather. It was absolute, unadulterated freedom. Printed on a small rectangle of paper, she felt a trembling in her fingers as she reached out. She hovered her hand over the check, feeling the heavy, expectant silence of the man watching her. She thought about her grandmother, about the tiny, cramped apartment they had shared, about the secret language spoken in the dark to keep the monsters at bay. She thought about where this money came from. It came from blood. It came from violence, from extortion, from the very world that had just dragged a man out the back door to be executed in an alleyway. Slowly, Sadie pulled her hand back. She looked up at Ezra, her heart hammering against her ribs, but a strange, foreign warmth spreading through her chest. It was courage. It was tiny, fragile, but it was there. I can't take that, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. Ezra's brow furrowed slightly. The look of surprise on his face was genuine. It's clean money, Sadie. I told you, nobody will come looking for it. It's not about that, she replied, sitting up a little straighter, the cold glass of the window no longer feeling like a trap, but a solid foundation. My grandmother. She didn't teach me those words so I could sell them. She taught me so I could remember who we were. She said our language was the only thing no one could ever steal from us. She looked at the ancient parchment, then back at the check. If I take that money, I'm selling her. I'm selling the words. And I'm becoming part of this. She gestured vaguely to the empty diner, to the door where Marcus had disappeared. Ezra stared at her, the silence stretching long and heavy. He looked at the girl in the oversized uniform, really looked at her, and saw a spine made of steel that he hadn't noticed before. He was a man who believed everyone had a price. He had bought judges, politicians, and assassins. He had never, in his entire life, met someone who refused a fortune on principle. You are a very foolish girl, Ezra said softly. But there was no malice in his voice. There was only a profound, quiet awe. Maybe, Sadie agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. But I sleep at night. Ezra looked down at the check, then at the parchment. He picked up the check, folded it precisely in half, and put it back in his pocket. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten her. He simply accepted her truth, a truth far more powerful than the millions he possessed. The rejection of the money shifted the dynamic in the booth entirely. The power, which had radiated off Ezra in suffocating waves since he walked in, suddenly felt balanced. He wasn't looking at a terrified waitress anymore. He was looking at an equal, someone who possessed a moral clarity he had abandoned decades ago. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, clasping his hands together, the scarred, violent hands of a syndicate boss. If you won't take the money, Ezra said, his voice stripped of all its commanding edge, leaving only a raw, grounded honesty. What do you want? I owe you a debt, Sadie. In my world, a debt of this magnitude must be settled, or it becomes a weakness. You gave me the name of the man who murdered my mother. You gave me back my father's legacy. You name your price. Anything. Sadie looked at him. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the heavy, crushing burden of the crown he wore. She realized, with a sudden, startling clarity, that he was just as trapped in his life as she felt in hers. He was surrounded by luxury and power, but he lived in a paranoid nightmare where his best friend was his executioner. She took a deep breath, the scent of the stale coffee and ozone filling her lungs. She didn't want a mansion. She didn't want cars or jewelry. She wanted what she had always wanted, but had been too afraid to demand. She wanted to feel safe. I want you to leave, Sadie said, her voice steady, locking eyes with the most dangerous man in the city. I want you to walk out of that door and never come back to this diner. I want you to make sure none of your men ever come here. I want this place. She gestured around the greasy, run-down room to be off-limits. To everyone in your world. Ezra studied her face, searching for a hidden angle. A trap. He found none. Just a quiet, desperate plea for a sanctuary. This diner? He asked, a hint of incredulity in his voice. You could have the city, and you want a greasy spoon protected? It's not just a diner, Sadie replied, her hands unclenching in her lap. It's the only place I've ever felt invisible, in a good way. It's where people go when they have nowhere else. They don't need your war spilling in here. And I don't want to look at that door every night, wondering if the monsters are coming back. Ezra sat back, a slow, profound realization dawning on his face. He looked around the diner, seeing the scuffed floors, the flickering neon light, the cheap leather booths. He saw it through her eyes, a fragile, necessary haven for the broken. He looked back at Sadie, and for the first time all night, the coldness in his eyes completely vanished. It was replaced by a look of deep, unconditional respect. Done, Ezra said quietly. It wasn't a promise. It was a decree. From this moment on, the Starlight Diner is a ghost zone. No one in my organization, and no one in any organization I control, will ever cross that threshold with intent. You have my word on my mother's soul. Sadie felt a massive, invisible weight lift off her chest. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding since the bell rang an hour ago. Thank you, she whispered. Ezra reached across the table and picked up the ancient parchment. He folded it carefully, reverently, and placed it in his inner coat pocket. The document had done its job. It had spoken from the grave, delivered its bloody truth, and shifted the balance of power in the city forever. He stood up, smoothing his tailored overcoat. He looked impossibly tall, an imposing figure of darkness against the flickering neon lights. But he no longer radiated that suffocating terror. He just looked tired. The man in the back, Sadie blurted out, her voice stopping him before he turned away. She couldn't help it. The thought of Marcus dead in the alleyway was a cold knot in her stomach. Are you? Did you? Ezra paused, looking down at her. Marcus will not return to this diner, he said, his tone deliberately vague, sparing her the brutal reality of his world. He has an appointment to keep with the consequences of his actions. Do not weep for him, Sadie. He chose his path 10 years ago. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, dull silver coin. It wasn't currency. It had a strange, intricate engraving on it, an emblem of a wolf circling a crown. He placed it gently on the formica table in front of her. If the world ever gets too heavy, Ezra said, his voice a low, comforting rumble, or if someone who doesn't respect my word walks through that door, you show them this. It means you are under the direct, personal protection of the head of the syndicate. It means a war will fall upon anyone who touches you. Sadie stared at the coin. It was a terrifying object, a symbol of immense violence, but it was also a shield. She looked up at Ezra, nodding slowly. She didn't say thank you again. Words felt inadequate. Ezra gave her a slight, almost imperceptible bow of his head, a gesture of profound respect from a king to a commoner. Then, he turned and walked toward the front door. He moved with the same quiet grace, the same absolute authority, but the suffocating pressure had lifted. He opened the heavy glass door. The storm outside had broken. The rain had stopped, and the first, pale gray light of dawn was beginning to bleed over the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the wet pavement. Ezra stepped out into the cold morning air, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft click, leaving the diner in profound silence. Sadie sat in the back booth for a long time after Ezra disappeared into the dawn. The diner was completely silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerators in the kitchen. She looked at the 2 empty coffee mugs on the table, the faint ring of condensation on the formica, and the heavy silver coin resting near the edge. It felt like she had just woken up from a violent, vivid fever dream. But the cold metal of the coin against her fingertips was undeniably real. She had done it. She had stepped out of the shadows, spoken a dead language, exposed a Mafia coup, and walked away entirely unscathed. She had refused $10 million and demanded peace instead. Slowly, Sadie slid out of the booth. Her legs felt a little unsteady, trembling slightly with the delayed adrenaline crash, but she didn't feel weak. She walked behind the counter and picked up her damp rag. She walked back to the booth and began to wipe down the table, moving the mugs aside. The rhythmic, circular motion was the same as it had been an hour ago, but it no longer felt like a desperate anchor to keep her from drifting away. It felt purposeful. She picked up the silver coin and slipped it deep into the pocket of her oversized apron. It felt heavy against her thigh, a secret weight of power. She didn't want it. She didn't want to belong to Ezra's world, but she understood its value. It was the physical manifestation of her own courage. The bell over the front door chimed. Sadie didn't flinch. She didn't drop the rag. She didn't instinctively shrink back into the shadows. She stood tall, wiping the table, and turned to face the door. An exhausted-looking nurse in blue scrubs walked in, shaking a wet umbrella. The woman looked around, finding an empty booth near the front, and sat down with a heavy sigh. "Just coffee, honey," the nurse called out, rubbing her temples. "Black as you can make it." "Coming right up," Sadie replied. Her voice was clear, steady, and loud enough to fill the space without trembling. She walked behind the counter, grabbed a fresh mug, and poured the steaming coffee. She didn't look at the floor as she walked over to the nurse. She looked straight ahead. She set the mug down gently, offering a small, genuine smile. "Long night?" Sadie asked. The nurse looked up, surprised by the interaction, then smiled back wearily. "You have no idea." "I think I might," Sadie said softly. She walked back to her station behind the counter. She caught her reflection in the stainless steel surface of the pie case. The uniform was still too big. The bun still pulled tight. But the girl looking back at her was different. The perpetual fear, the desperate need to be invisible, was gone. The timid waitress who was afraid of her own shadow had died in that back booth, replaced by the woman who had silenced a mafia boss with the truth. The storm had passed. The morning light was washing over the greasy windows of the Starlight Diner, chasing away the neon shadows. Sadie poured herself a small cup of coffee, breathing in the bitter aroma, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt entirely, undeniably alive, armed with the knowledge that even the quietest voice, speaking the truth in the dark, could bring empires to their knees. True power doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers in a forgotten language. Sadie's story reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to speak the truth, even when your hands are shaking. The shy waitress proved that integrity and knowing your own worth can silence the most terrifying forces in the world. Far beyond the reach of any blood money, she chose peace over a poisoned fortune, finding her voice in the darkest of hours. If this intense, cinematic journey kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit the like button and share it with someone who loves a gripping, character-driven drama. Don't forget to subscribe for more vivid, real-life feeling stories where ordinary people face impossible odds. Let us know in the comments, would you have taken the 10 million?